everyone. I'm Meryl Richards, the moderator for today's live streamed launch event for the series and IAGC brief on the role of natural climate solutions in corporate climate commitments. I'm a director of research on the Food and Forest team here at Ceres, which is a nonprofit organization working with the most influential capital market leaders to solve the world's greatest sustainability challenges. Before we begin today's session, just a few logistical notes. This will be quick. First, please note that the session is being recorded and will provide all participants who registered with a link to the recording shortly after its completion, which you can also share with colleagues who might have missed the session. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can enter them in the Q&A box, which is on the right lower hand corner of your screen. And my colleagues and co-authors will be answering some questions as they come up, and we'll also have some time for our panelists to answer some questions live. If you have a technical question, such as trouble with audio, please also type that into the Q&A box and we'll try to sort it out for you. I'd love to thank each of our speakers for participating in today's event. Our speakers are Carolyn Ching, Chris Dodwell, and Stephen D'Onofrio. Carolyn is a senior manager on the Food and Forest team here at Ceres and leads our work on natural climate solutions and carbon credits. She joined Ceres after nearly a decade at Verra, where she played a central role in the development and growth of the verified carbon standard, and also led the development of methodologies for assessing the greenhouse gas impacts of agriculture and forestry policies for the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency. I'd also like to welcome Chris Dodwell. Chris is a climate change and environmental policy expert. He's got over 25 years experience in the public and private sector, including a stint as head of international climate policy at the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change. Chris is currently head of policy and advocacy at Impacts Asset Management. And we're especially grateful to him because he provided really valuable input throughout the development of this brief. Stephen D'Onofrio is Program Director of Ecosystem Marketplace and the Supply Chain Initiatives at Forest Trends. Forest Trends is a longtime collaborator of Ceres. He spent his career working with companies on ESG issues, including positions as a vice president at CDP and an economist at the Chicago Climate Exchange. So thanks, Carolyn, Chris, and Stephen, so much for joining us, and you'll be hearing more from them in just a bit. So as you probably know, if you're joining this webinar, today we're launching a new resource from Ceres and the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change called The Role of Natural Climate Solutions in Corporate Climate Commitments. Carolyn's going to start our session today by providing a few key takeaways from that brief for investors to bring into their engagements. Then we'll move into a discussion with Chris and Stephen to further elaborate on some of those key messages. Before we get started, I'd like to note that what's really integral to our discussion today is the role that natural and working lands play in mitigating climate change. And I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Native and Indigenous peoples, both in the US and globally, who've stewarded these lands for generations with attention to both people and the environment. And we do this to affirm our commitment to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people around the world, including through our own work. And we'll further elaborate on this in the discussion in the context of carbon markets. So now I am happy to turn it over to Carolyn Ching.
Thank you so much, Meryl. Dear colleague, thank you for joining us today for the launch of this report. If you are joining the webinar, you're probably aware that the carbon market is taking off again. Offsetting is all over the news, and many companies are making huge commitments to tree planting, forest protection, and other nature-based forms of emission reductions and carbon removals, also called natural climate solutions. You're probably also aware that there is a wide divergence of views on this trend. Some are saying that carbon markets are a viable part of net zero strategies, and others are saying that net zero pledges are meaningless because they rely too heavily on offsetting. Ceres and IGCC wrote this brief to provide what we hope is a balanced piece of guidance for investors to use to assess strategies of companies in their portfolios and engage companies on this topic. So natural climate solutions refers to a variety of actions to protect, improve, or restore natural or working lands. For example, avoiding deforestation of primary old growth forests, improving the management of agricultural timberland, or restoring forests or wetlands. All of these actions either reduce emissions or they remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it in the biomass or soils. So part of the reason why we're seeing increased demand for NCS is because some of them, like reforestation and afforestation, also known as tree planting, can remove and store carbon dioxide in a way that's currently more cost-effective and widely available than the alternatives, which are technological forms of direct air carbon removal, they're technological forms of carbon removal like direct air carbon capture and storage. NCS also plays a large proportion of, NCS provides a large proportion of the projected available carbon credits from emission reductions. And according to recent data from Ecosystem Marketplace, in the first quarter of 2021, retirements from carbon credits from forestry surpassed all other types. So NCS are not necessarily synonymous with carbon credits or offsetting. Companies are incorporating natural climate solutions into their climate strategies in several different ways. Some of them don't involve the carbon market at all. Companies that produce agriculture or forestry projects, which are concentrated in the consumer goods, consumer discretionary, and materials sectors, may support NCS as a way to reduce emissions or sequester carbon within their own value chains. Because this is a way for companies to reduce their own value chain emissions, it's not really considered offsetting. And then there are some companies that foresee a future in which carbon credits have greater value. And so they're directly investing in the development of NCS projects, intending either to sell the credits in the future or purchase them for use towards their own climate targets. And then finally, there are some companies that don't have emissions from land use within their own value chains, and they are purchasing carbon credits from NCS projects as a way to offset their emissions. This kind of use constitutes much of the growing demand for nature-based credits, and it's arguably more controversial. Ceres did reviewed a sample of 45 companies that publicly announced net zero targets between November 2020 and March 2021, and found that about 44%, about 20 companies, indicated that they will use NCS in a way to meet these targets. And of those companies, 16 of them identified offsetting with forest-based carbon credits as an intended strategy. So NCS presents an enormous opportunity for companies and their investors. But because this is a strategy that so many companies are relying on, it is critical that we get it right. Without guardrails on their appropriate use, natural climate solutions, particularly when they're used to offset emissions, can expose companies and their investors to material business risks. So on one hand, over-reliance on offsetting rather than decarbonization would exacerbate the systemic risk of climate change by compromising our ability to reach the 1.5 degree or 2 degree C target that we've set for ourselves under the Paris Agreement. And this isn't really a new risk. It's sort of why offsetting has long been controversial. However, the surge in demand for carbon credits associated with net zero commitments is renewing concerns. Additionally, some carbon credits have been accused of inflating emission reduction estimates, or they've been associated with land conflicts or human rights abuses. And while these problems are rarely deliberate, they can be a source of reputational risks for companies and their investors. So what should companies be doing to minimize those risks and maximize the value of their investments in NCS? And how can investors tell that they are doing so? We've highlighted 3 key takeaways. The first is that companies should use NCS in a way that raises the ambition of their climate commitments. And NCS must provide credible climate mitigation, and NCS must also provide social and environmental benefits. So the first key message is that companies should use NCS in a way that raises the ambition of their climate commitments. So what this means is that companies should be prioritizing reducing emissions within their own value chain, And so that means that their annual emissions, which are represented by the gray bars, the dark gray bars in this graph, stay below the orange line, which is the 1.5 degree emissions pathway. And they should be reducing emissions along their value chain, scope 1, 2, and 3. And then to be truly net zero, according to the guidance, the draft guidance that's been released by SBTI, the companies, after they've reduced their emissions as far as technologically and economically feasible, then they should balance out their residual emissions with carbon removals. And that's represented by the purple bars underneath the green axis. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that companies must wait until they have nearly eliminated all of their emissions before investing in natural climate solutions. While they're on their journey to true net zero, companies can additionally choose to purchase high quality carbon credits or financially support emission reduction or carbon dioxide removal efforts. And that's shown here by the light gray bars that are under the x-axis. So what this means to increase ambition is that companies should meet their emission reduction targets, and then they can purchase carbon credits in addition to doing so, not as a substitute. This looks somewhat different sector by sector, especially for companies in land intensive sectors. NCS should contribute to reducing the dark gray bars above the green line rather than just counting towards the light gray bars below the green line. I encourage you to consult the brief for additional details on this piece. The second key message in the brief is that NCS must provide credible climate change mitigation. This essentially means that the project effectively reduces greenhouse gas emissions or removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And it's especially important when those emission reductions or removals are sold as carbon credits to offset emissions that are happening elsewhere. There are about 6 or so general criteria that the carbon crediting programs have set out, which projects need to meet in order to demonstrate that they're generating real climate change mitigation. I won't go through all of those here because they're quite detailed, but in general, these recognized greenhouse gas programs have procedures for developing robust projects that are accurately measured. While the specific methodologies vary from program to program, buying credits from one of these greenhouse gas crediting programs can reduce the risk of purchasing credits that are not real. And if they are found not to be, it's the responsibility, or should be the responsibility, of the program to rectify that problem. Of course, it's not always the case that buying from a recognized program reduces risk, but it does eliminate that risk. Next slide, please, Courtney. Some of the companies purchasing credits from avoided deforestation and project management and forest management projects have recently faced scrutiny because they purchased forest carbon credits that were created using imperfect methodologies. So companies can further reduce the risk of sourcing low quality credits by conducting additional due diligence for certain project types, and also specifically by reviewing the project measurement methodology and the project monitoring reports. Next slide. So natural climate solutions have a large potential to protect biodiversity, improve soil fertility, decrease erosion, and improve water quality and quantity. And depending on where projects are located and how they are designed, they can also provide new sources of income for rural landowners and local communities. But if a project is not appropriately designed or implemented, it can have detrimental impacts on the land or in the communities where they are located. For example, there could be increased conflict over land rights in some of these areas. With a growing market for land-based carbon credits, there's heightened public awareness of the risk of land grabbing or human rights abuses. And because of the longstanding power imbalances and inequalities, these risks are most acute for projects developed in the global north and then sited in the global south, and especially within Indigenous communities. So NCS projects, and especially forest-based projects that avoid harm and maximize benefits, are characterized by attention to environmental and social issues in their design and execution. For example, reforestation projects should use native species that are well suited to the project location and appropriate diversity of species. And projects should ensure clear land title and delineation of land rights. They should ensure equitable sharing of benefits, and they should ensure access to legal counsel and mechanisms for redress in the case of accidental harm. Some of the greenhouse gas crediting programs provide assurance that projects provide benefits to local communities and ecosystems. And those are the ones that are in the middle of this graph. That includes Gold Standard, Plan Vivo, and Architecture for REDD+ transactions. Other programs like the American Carbon Registry and Verified Carbon Standard, they have less stringent requirements on the social and environmental benefit side. So companies can source credits that are certified under that are duly certified under these programs, and something on the right-hand side of this graph, like the CCBS or the Sustainable Development Impact Standard. Those are standalone certifications that assess the social and environmental benefits of the project. And these are especially important for projects that are sited in the Global South and involve Indigenous and Native communities. So to summarize, corporate use of NCS should raise the ambition of climate commitments, provide credible climate change mitigation, and provide social and environmental benefits. But there are a few companies currently disclosing enough about their net zero targets, their NCS investments, and their carbon credit purchases to allow for the independent assessment of their strategies and by their shareholders. So to enable greater transparency, we suggest that investors ask companies for these disclosures. Companies should disclose their progress against the short, medium, and long-term targets aligned with 1.5 degrees C scenarios, and they should disclose how much of their targets will be met through the use of carbon credits or carbon removals. Currently, targets validated by SBTi cannot be met using carbon credits, but net zero targets a bit of a wild west. So these two disclosures allow investors to assess whether companies' NCS investments outside of their supply chains are increasing the ambition of their climate commitments. To ensure that NCS investments provide credible climate change mitigation, we also recommend that investors ask companies to disclose which greenhouse gas crediting programs, suppliers, and projects for which of these programs, suppliers, and projects that the carbon credits are sourced from. For companies that are investing directly in NCS in their supply chains, they should disclose the measurement methodology, such as they would in CDP reporting. And finally, to ensure that social and environmental benefits happen beyond just carbon, we suggest that companies disclose whether carbon credit purchases are certified under a social and environmental standard. So natural climate solutions will be a critical part of climate action plans and how companies get to net zero. Investors have a powerful opportunity to help companies avoid climate-related and reputational risks. And ultimately, such transparency will create greater confidence in the integrity of net zero targets, and they will help ensure that companies deliver on their commitments to cut emissions. This is the conclusion of our report, and thank you so much for joining us today for the launch of it.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. So we've had a few questions come in, and we have a little bit of time before we kick off our panel with Stephen and Chris to answer a couple questions. So I will read out a couple of these. So we have someone is asking, what are carbon removals, and could you provide a couple examples?
Sure. So carbon removals are in the NCS space, they are the types of activities that sequester carbon from the atmosphere, and then they lock that carbon into the biomass of into their biomass. So in particular, we're talking about tree planting, reforestation, and afforestation activities. And then also in some instances in agricultural settings, through certain practices, you can lock carbon into the soil as well.
Thanks, Carolyn. So we've got another question about what differences would you make between natural climate solutions and nature-based solutions?
That's a great one. So broadly speaking, nature-based solutions sort of covers all of the ways in which our natural environment can sort of provide, trying not to use just the words nature-based, but they're essentially like ecosystem services. So a robust ecosystem can filter out water and provide through, its healthy soils and healthy rivers and riverways, and it can provide clean water out the other end. Or if an ecosystem has a diversity of species, it can be really good for pollinators and support, a healthy, abundant species in that ecosystem. And when it comes to nature-based solutions, we're sort of talking about all of those different aspects of solutions that nature can provide, including like pollination, clean water, healthy soils, as well as carbon removal or carbon sequestration. When we're talking about natural climate solutions, we're just focusing in on that column of solutions that's specifically focused on climate and carbon. And we're not talking about some of the other things like water quality, soil fertility, and pollination.
Thanks. So natural climate solutions are sort of a subset of nature-based solutions in a way. We've got a couple other questions. There's some great questions here. This one is about, we've seen some companies such as Microsoft go rogue, and I like that phrasing, and purchase credits and removals that are not certified by traditional third parties like Gold Standard, BCS, but instead develop their own criteria. Do you see this as a risk to the standards of the current offset market or a natural broadening acceleration of it? Noting that I think what Microsoft has done is mainly for carbon removals. So especially given some high profile, thoroughly vetted forestry projects that have recently come under scrutiny as the context for that question.
Yeah, I think this is a very challenging question because on one hand, I think that some of the traditional third-party standards have been in the voluntary carbon market for a long time, although recognizing that the voluntary carbon market is actually very young. And so there's a lot that those standards have learned over the course of the last couple of decades of voluntary carbon markets and carbon markets in general. And they continue to grow and progress along with that. And I think that the standards being third party probably helps others, like other stakeholders that might not necessarily be part of Microsoft or investors or shareholders. They might be like the general public or journalists or media, and they might prefer to see companies using third-party standards because it reduces the likelihood or the perception of sort of doing something wrong with, what's the word I'm looking for? It reduces the perception of, if they're using a third-party standard, to reduce the perception of greenwashing or kind of skirting around their responsibilities. But then at the same time, I think it's possible that organizations or companies like Microsoft or even Amazon, if they are capable of investing in and finding very good scientific brains to help them develop these standards, that they can be as robust as some of the ones that already exist.
Thanks, Carolyn. So this is sparking a lot of conversation. We've got a lot of questions coming in. Let's see. To any comments on the wide variety of the cost of carbon credits, from sub $5 to up to $100 plus, and does this in some way undermine the credibility of NCS credits? It's a question from Brian O'Kennedy.
I do think that that's a tricky one. I think that the varying costs all over the board make it hard for buyers to determine quality. I think generally speaking, most of us walk into a grocery store and we think that if it costs more, it's higher quality. But I think that in many of these cases, because this market isn't necessarily like a perfect market of supply and demand, that the cost is not a really good reflection of quality. Instead, I think what it reflects is maybe like scale. So for example, projects that avoid deforestation have a lot of carbon in the forest where, where they're, and oftentimes they're located in like tropical locations where there is a lot of carbon stored in that biomass. And if you're protecting a large area, that's a huge amount of scale where you might not have necessarily a lot of costs because your activities are protecting the forest with like maybe rangers on the ground, and maybe you have a few vehicles, but you might not have a lot of overhead costs. On the flip side, reforestation and afforestation, planting trees, does cost a lot of money. It takes a lot of upfront resources to do that. And it takes a while for reforestation to actually, sequester carbon. It takes time for the trees to grow and lock in that carbon. And so the amount of carbon that they're growing might be smaller. And therefore the cost is kind of more a reflection of like the cost of implementation versus really the quality of the credit, I would say. So the wide variety, I do agree, it makes it challenging to understand like the quality of credits.
Thanks. And this is actually a great follow-on to that. So we've got time for about one more question. Charlie Costello is asking, how do you define a high quality carbon credit?
Yeah, so this is sort of one of the key things that the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets is discussing, but also a number of the programs that have, the GHG programs that have been available on the market have sort of thought about this for a very long time. So the key things are that the project needs to be additional. The quantification needs to be conservatively estimated. Baselines need to be conservative. Leakage needs to be accounted for. Projects must be permanent. They need to be verified and they need to be monitored. And there might even be one or two other things. But this list of criteria have been sort of established, and they're well known within the voluntary carbon market space about what sorts of criteria projects need to meet. And then based on those criteria, a number of methodologies have been developed over the course that the methodologies sort of like specifically focus on the different types of activities, and they help project developers quantify and measure what those emission reductions or carbon removals might be. And so when we're looking for high quality carbon credits, we want the projects to be able to demonstrate that they're meeting these criteria sort of relatively easily. Hard to explain, but they want to be able to understand that those criteria are being met. And then at the same time, which is what we're emphasizing in our report, we also want to see that social and environmental benefits are being achieved. So we're not just trying to lock in carbon, we also want, sort of broadly speaking, functioning societies and ecosystems where these projects are happening.
Great, thank you so much, Carolyn. So if you typed in a question and we didn't get to it, don't worry, we'll have more time for Q&A at the end with Carolyn as well as Stephen and Chris. So let's now transition to our discussion with Chris Dodwell from Impacts Asset Management. Chris, thanks so much for being with us today. To start us off, could you provide a brief introduction to your background and your Impacts' current work related to natural climate solutions?
Sure thing, Meryl. So thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here, and thanks. A lot of great questions coming up there, and maybe we'll shed some light on some of those later on. So my background was I worked as a civil servant in the UK government for about 20 years. And one of the first things I did actually when I went in there as a lawyer was drafting the rules of the UK emissions trading system. I then worked on the negotiation of the European carbon market. And some of the stuff we had to think about back then was what kind of crediting mechanisms would be allowed. So this question of linking and crediting systems kind of is very, has been around for a long while, 20 years ago. So, and also I was fortunate enough when I led the UK delegation to the climate talks to have been in Bali when we agreed the rules for REDD Plus first off. Now, I have to say, I was always rather scared of the deforestation questions. Fortunately, I had a bunch of really good experts on the team who did it. But I've kind of come back to this issue and really appreciate the kind of thoughtful way that Ceres and IGCC have approached it. I think it's a really valuable paper that you've done. So what I do at Impacts is I'm head of policy and advocacy. So that means I advise our investment teams on policy decisions that are likely to affect things. And there's a lot of carbon pricing, as people can probably understand. Anyone who tracks what's happening in Europe at the moment, carbon pricing is a key policy development. But also I get involved in advocacy, and Impacts is increasingly focused on natural capital and deforestation. So we are members of the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure. We've got involved in some of the UK government's follow-up to the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity, the kind of Stern review for biodiversity. And also just recently, we've started talking to the Convention on Biological Diversity around their new framework that they're trying to negotiate. So hopefully I've got a few insights to share. And I guess I ought to say that Impacts is an asset manager that is wholly focused on opportunities arising from the transition to a sustainable economy. So we're really focused on climate and environmental issues, across all of our business.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and I'd say you probably have more than a few insights to share. So thanks for joining us. So what are your expectations, given that natural climate solutions are such an opportunity, but also a risk? What are your expectations for how companies can use them to achieve net zero?
Yeah, I think the first thing to be said, and this touches on some of the questions that have been raised in the chat, is that our view is that the key thing that we need to be doing now is mobilizing the finance necessary to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, some people think this is, there's an element of that is around stopping financing fossil fuel generating activities. So you could say that's about decarbonizing your portfolio or, just emission reductions within firms. But equally, we need to be scaling up financial flows into solutions. So I think, as you flagged in the report and as Carolyn just went through, there's a really key job to be done in scaling up investment into natural climate solutions. And there are a variety of different solutions out there. A lot of the time, people just think this is about forests and maybe keeping forests standing or planting trees. But there is a whole heap of potential ways of managing grasslands better, improving soil standards. There's a lot of activities out there, and at the moment we're skimming the surface of them, and if we don't embrace them and put money into them, then we won't get anywhere. It's a little bit like, some people may recall, the Clean Development Mechanism many years back, that was for developing countries and a crediting mechanism, but actually helped build capacity in the countries around the potential for solutions. And now that was the forerunner of mass renewables and solar schemes. So I think there's a real need to scale up flows, and that's one of the benefits that can come from this. As I said, Impacts is really interested in investing in solution providers. And I think, as your paper explores, where you're looking within the value chain, there's a lot more scope for kind of oversight within your own activities, because people are looking to decarbonize their value chains. They are close to their suppliers and they understand the pressures that they're under. And there's a lot of scope to actually do some of this. And some of the most creative things, in particular in agriculture and food supply, comes within the value chain. Now, that's not saying that's not without risk, because you've still got to measure and ensure that things happen, but you have that level of oversight. But I guess what offsetting and natural climate solutions is, creates a mechanism to increase flows by allowing others access to the same sort of climate solutions. And I think one of the things that one of the people who asked a question on earlier on was around offsetting. Doesn't this just let people off? And I guess that was what was interesting in the way that you presented the, when are you allowed to use them question, because I think that is absolutely crucial. So if you're just allowed to use offsets and natural climate solutions to get a free ride, then that is not an acceptable use. But at the moment, what we don't really know is how to benchmark net zero targets. There's a whole heap of targets being set at the moment. So again, I think your paper rightly identifies the fact that there's a tension there. But if you're going beyond the delivery of a reasonable pathway, so if you're starting to go beneath that curve, or the Microsoft activity of offsetting all your emissions, well, actually, that looks like that's quite a legitimate way of generating flows. And then the last thing I think is just in relation to the way that I guess it's the tone of the paper overall. What I think you've done is you've basically demystified an issue that now people need to understand. You've identified what the key issues are, and then you've started the ball rolling around traceability and transparency. And the first stage of that has got to be asking the right questions. So throughout the paper, I think what's great is the way that you've picked out this. If you want to be asking questions about this around the supply or around the credibility of the offsets, you've given that first go. But also what you've done is you've recognized that there are limits to knowledge. So there will be more debate on this over the next months and years. At the moment, this is a sector that is governed by kind of NGOs and initiatives. It's not really governed by national governments. So one can anticipate that actually some of these questions will get solved by regulators. And again, you've identified the fact that if you're offsetting if you're using credits from a country that may shift to a jurisdictional approach, well, actually that's going to affect maybe your ability to access those credits. So there are some risks involved there as well. So I guess I'm really endorsing the framework that you've put together. Think about where they can be used, ensure their credibility and integrity of the offsets, and we'll come on hopefully to some discussion around additional co-benefits.
All great points, thank you. So you've talked a little bit about this. You touched a little bit about this on your previous answer, but what do you see as the benefits and drawbacks to the proliferation of corporate net zero targets, which incorporate use of natural climate solutions?
Yeah, so I think that what's great about them is that they are a really simple message, and that can really lead. The concept of net zero has, transformed the kind of the post-Paris Agreement world. Now we know where we're heading to. It's a very simple message. And at Impacts, we wholly endorse the idea of net zero. We think that country level targets is the direction of travel to go in, and what you want to see are sectoral pathways to get there. Within companies, they can really catalyze enthusiasm for identifying opportunities and risks, and how to maybe, you also see big breakthroughs in terms of supply chain. So bulk orders for renewables or low carbon products, which are now being driven by power purchase agreements from the tech firms in the US. So this is all good. You can also have, once you've got multiple sectoral commitments, you can start to have pre-competitive behavior to drive down costs of new technology. So say in the steel sector or in the cement sector, you have collaboration. And then lastly, this idea of generating revenue for activities that don't generate revenue themselves, like natural climate solutions. But I guess and I think people have touched on this again in the questions, there are definitional and interpretational questions that kind of need to get solved. So there's a question around how much by when, which are back to the pathways that Carolyn showed earlier on. So how do you judge when someone's been set a stringent enough target, and what degree is one allowed to offset emissions within that? But I think there are also some other questions around, well, if you're in a sector that can't reduce its emissions to zero, is there, and that's recognized by society. So say agriculture is the most obvious one, but also cement will find it very difficult to get to zero. Why are you imposing an additional cost of offsetting that residual emission? Because isn't that business continuing to function to benefit society, and possibly even to, I don't know, make the steel that you need to build the wind turbines? So I do think there are some questions there around kind of distribution of effort and capital efficiency.
Great, thanks. So shifting gears a little bit, one thing that you really emphasized throughout the development of this investor brief, and we appreciated that, was the need to ensure that we aren't doing things that are good for the climate, but bad for nature and biodiversity. And Carolyn talked about this a bit. We've also got some questions in the Q&A. Can you elaborate a bit on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting the way Carolyn's answer to the question. So I was commenting on the paper from the IIGCC working group, and actually we call our working group nature-based solutions, because kind of on this side of the pond, we think about nature-based solutions as nature-based solutions for climate. So it's a kind of, the two phrases mean the same to us. But there is a broader category of risk associated with biodiversity, and I've mentioned a couple of the initiatives in that space that we are going to need to tackle at the same time as we tackle climate change. So the UK government has recognised this in its campaigns it's put together for COP26, and it's having a real focus on establishing systems for deforestation-free supply chains. That's one of the things they're talking about. It's called the FACT dialogue, forestry, agricultural and trade dialogue. And that's ministries from and consumer countries coming together to say, let's make this supply chain deforestation free. So if you avoid deforestation, that is obviously going to have a benefit for biodiversity and for the climate. But if you take other options like planting monoculture in perhaps grassland or something like that, that could actually enhance biodiversity loss. So what we need to do is work out how to maximize the win-win potential, and to, again, I think if you're involved in the supply chain, if you're working in an area that is proximate to your own activities, you'll understand what those social benefits are. The biodiversity ones we need to be smarter about, and that's one of the things we're working with the Secretariat of CBD around. And just a final thought on that, I mean, I think one of the things we need to do is, well, how do you measure these issues around biodiversity? That's a challenge, but hopefully they're stepping up to the mark on it. In terms of an equivalent to the Paris goals and net zero, we're very supportive of something that Business for Nature have come up with, which is the idea of halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030, because we think that's a really actionable aim. And it also gives you the idea that actually if your natural climate solution is not helping to halt biodiversity loss, you shouldn't really be doing it. So you need to be thinking, how can you actually help regenerate and build ecosystems? And it's a great opportunity to get people more engaged with those issues, as well as their climate, the carbon removal potential.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. Let's transition over to Stephen now. Stephen Donofrio from Forest Trends leads their ecosystem marketplace and supply chain initiatives. Stephen, I wonder if you might be able to elaborate on some of what Chris has been telling us about. So Ecosystem Marketplace recently released the third installment of its 2020 State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets report. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the key trends that you're seeing with buyers as more companies set net zero commitments. And maybe also, are we seeing more demand for projects that take social and environmental impacts into account?
Yep. Thank you so much, Meryl. I appreciate you inviting me to this session, and apologies for having to be late. I was running from another previous commitment where I was on a panel as well. But I think it articulates just that one was also very interested in it was the investment into nature-based solutions or forestry in North America from an offsets perspective, and really just illuminates, I think, the growing interest in this investment category, where it's, this is not something that's brand new, but it's been around for a number of years, but is just growing in appeal. So I think just maybe quickly to say, what we do is to kind of track the market. We do that by direct surveying engagement with market actors worldwide. Last year, we had over 150 organizations that reported to us. We are moving from an annual cycle to a regular data collection cycle that's very flexible for market actors. Traditionally, these are suppliers, product developers, and intermediaries in the market, financiers. Last year, we had market transactions from over 73 countries, 20 standards, 41 project types, and 21 buyer sectors. So diverse amount of information here. And I think that is really important for us to keep in mind when asking questions around, what is the demand side look like and what does the supply side look like? Because it, as you know, no one company, even if they're both in the consumer discretionary sector, really operates and is exactly the same. And net zero goals and ambitions that are coming out, now with, I think, it's something like, over somewhere around 2,000 largest public companies and 14 that represent 14 trillion in assets. That is a huge amount of opportunity for us to harness, because these net zero goals are not going to take place overnight. And so with the understanding that we need to really tackle the emissions and try to get a handle on the footprint that's before us, as companies and as investors, that there's a pathway there that leads to awareness and leads to an understanding of what those gaps are. Where can you invest now in offsets, because you just cannot make those reductions because of a long-term investment that you need to make into more capital expenditure and longer return on investment type of game plans. And so what we try to do is help to articulate that, what is the state of the market, what are the supply side, what's shifting, and what we've seen in the past few years is just a tremendous shift into forestry and land use. This is, driven prominently by REDD+, which is around essentially, conserving forests, natural rainforests in tropical countries from deforestation and degradation, while supporting on the ground communities, indigenous and traditional communities, and improving livelihoods, locally. So this finance is incredibly important, and what we're seeing in the from the survey we launched last year, which tackled 2019 calendar year, was that in Europe was the leading demand region. North America was second, as you might imagine. There's a lot of nuances here where Europe heavily favored nature-based solutions projects, such as REDD+ or like reforestation, but also because of dynamics that have to do with the voluntary market, their credits were coming from outside of the European territory. North America was a bit different, where the diversity was more split in different project categories. Nature-based solutions were definitely up there at the top, but what you see is in both of these regions that the finance and insurance sector was already starting to make some early plays and being the leading sector, with energy also being a leading sector in Europe. Finance and insurance was number 2. Whereas finance and insurance was number 1 in terms of sector in North America, in terms of the most purchase and demand of offsets. And so that's, I think, going to show just sort of all this activity we've seen in the last few months around creating some guidelines for different parts of the finance sector around offsets, and how to tackle invested emissions. While also, helping to support, companies that are in their portfolios or where they're investing on those net zero goals, which are still very early days. But I think these are some of the dynamics of the demand side, which are, I think, really important to understand. And then when you start to get into some of the other details around standard preference or, vintages of offsets that are being used, as well as prices and willingness to pay for offsets, it really starts to show that there's a lot more willingness to pay higher prices for projects that are based on forestry and land use, and that are coming, that are coming embedded with not just carbon, but other sustainability details, such as, livelihoods, biodiversity that was just mentioned, and also, things like watershed protection and other, features that these projects might have, to really prove that this is an opportunity to have a lot bigger narration that's not just on carbon and climate change, but is on a diverse set of issues that deal with sustainability.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen, and great to hear those insights from the latest report. I am going to shift over to some of our audience questions because we have a lot of fantastic questions coming in. Let's see. We have a question about, I assume the market for carbon will pay more for higher quality forest carbon. This is what you were just getting at, Stephen, with multiple co-benefits than forest carbon where sustainability features and benefits are not included or embedded. Chris, do you want to tackle this one a little bit? And then Stephen, perhaps you can add on.
Yeah, I can tell Stephen's got something to say about this one as well. I guess the point for me is that at the moment, the difficulty is that the quantification and the standards around those co-benefits are kind of less well documented and less transparent than they are around carbon. So if you're just thinking, if someone is, it then becomes discretionary, I suppose, for the buyer. What would be better is if we were able to track more clearly the kind of the biodiversity benefits through some kind of agreed metrics, and that I think is what we're pushing for through the work with the CBD, but also just generally around the financing of biodiversity. If you want to do some financing of nature positive activities, you've got to work out a way of quantifying that and expressing it clearly. And I don't think we're at a level where that is investor friendly, those metrics. I think some work needs to be done on that. But as Stephen has alluded to, there are good reasons why people would pay more for those credits for reputational reasons and other drivers.
Great, thanks, Chris. Stephen, do you want to add on to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that the standard for climate, community, and biodiversity has been around for, I think over a decade now, and that is not a carbon standard, but it's an add-on to carbon standards. And so when, for example, the leading standard in the voluntary market is the VCS which is developed by Verra, prices and interest in those types of credits that are coming from Verra that have the climate, community, and biodiversity standard on top of it, you see the higher prices for those credits. And also in the last year and a half, there's been developments by standards like the gold standard, developing new tools for the quantification of sustainable development goals, as well as SD Vista from Verra to do exactly what you're saying, to try to help improve the quantification and the definition of these sort of non-carbon benefits. And then there are other standards, I would just say, like Plan Vivo is an example where they are at their heart, and Gold Standard arguably is the same way, where at their heart, they are dedicated at Plan Vivo to working on projects that directly benefit Indigenous and local communities. And so, it's sort of a tenant requirement of those projects. So I think, part of this, like I said, is, there's a lot of, because this is not a compliance sort of standardized, market, that there's a lot of different standards out there. There's not one trading place where these credits are transacted, that it makes it very complicated, I think, for for folks that are kind of new into this space. But there has been a couple of decades already of activity to develop these standards and try to quantify essentially non-quantifiable benefits as best as possible. Anyway, I'll leave it there, but happy to continue to respond to any questions that come up.
Thanks so much, Stephen. So I think we have probably time for one more question. There's a question coming in, and I'm going to tweak it a little bit, which is, can you give any standout examples of net zero investment decisions or net zero commitments from companies that respect the human rights of communities? And I'm going to add, and also are ideal for the climate and respect biodiversity as well. And, maybe this isn't a specific company example, but what would be, your ideal example of a net zero commitment that did that? Does anybody want to tackle that one?
This is on the other side of the market for us, in terms of the kind of net zero commitments. But we launched a pilot last year where we looked at these net zero goals and tried to understand, where offsets were fitting in. What would be some of the terms around, project start date, vintages, the also, things around standard and we found, there's a lot of interest in this in offsets, but also when companies were stating offsets as part of their carbon zero strategy or net zero strategy, that forestry and land use, or what was more commonly called of natural climate solutions, are more common to see. And I don't have a good example of a particular company to offer you, because we typically don't work directly with companies in that way. But what we are seeing is sort of a diversity of companies that are coming to us asking and looking for this data to help inform their strategies, which increasingly is also from companies outside of North America and Europe and Asia markets, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean and Oceania. So there's as these net zero goals are expanding globally to different companies and different regions, that I think we'll start to see not only sort of more appetite for offsets, but another kind of key piece of information that we find is that companies are looking for homegrown offsets from within sort of boundaries that they operate in or where they're headquartered in. And so, Europe is sort of shifting quickly with standards like UK Woodlands Carbon Code to develop, more projects within those boundaries to help, make the more kind of direct connection, between climate responsibility and climate neutrality.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen. So unfortunately, we have to wrap up. This has been a really rich discussion, and I really appreciate, Stephen, Chris, and Carolyn, you sharing your insights with all of us, and also appreciate the great questions that we've had come in the Q&A. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of them, but we will endeavor to answer some of these and include it with the write-up and the link to the recording. You will receive a follow-up email with a recording shortly. So as I said, if you've got colleagues that missed the event, you can share that with them. And you can also download the new resource, The Role of Natural Climate Solutions in Corporate Climate Commitments, a brief for investors, at the address that Courtney has kindly put into the chat here. So be sure to click on that and copy it. For those interested in taking the next step, especially investors interested in taking the next step, Ceres does coordinate a number of networks and initiatives that offer investors the opportunity to collaborate on natural climate solutions, deforestation and supply chains, and climate change writ large, among other issues. These initiatives are described in the brief, and you can also feel free to contact the Food and Forest team at the email address that you see in the chat, and we'd be happy to connect with you. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful day.